Ron, the next thing I want to talk to you about is exterior insulation and finish system, also known as EIFS. There are different types of EIFS. There's barrier EIFS and there's drainable EIFS. First of all, why don't you explain to everybody what is EIFS?
Well, it's basically another cladding system. There's specific components that they've put into it. I'll use a barrier system as an example. That you have the sheathing that's on the exterior of the building, and all it is you glue or mechanically attach a piece of insulation board. Basically, it looks like the same material generally that you'd have in a styrofoam cup for coffee. You put that over the top of that sheathing, and then you come back and you put a base coat material, which is nothing but a real thin acrylic polymer cement-based material that goes on about 1/16 of an inch thick. Into that you put a reinforcement mesh, and you embed that in, and then you put a finish coat over the outside, and magically you're done with the cladding system.
So this barrier system is supposed to be a face-sealed barrier to water penetration, is that right?
Exactly, and if you didn't tell, I'm not exactly a fan of that.
Yeah, somehow I thought I knew that.
Okay.
Now there's also a drainable EIFS. What's the difference between the drainable EIFS and the barrier EIFS?
In the drainable system, you're putting it on much like most conventional claddings, where you have the sheathing, but over that you put a secondary barrier like building paper, Tyvek, some kind of building wrap that now gives you a second barrier that water can hit and be directed still to the outside and not go right to the sheathing. So you have that on, and then there's an airspace for water to drain down through. Then you put your same system like the barrier, basically, where you have the insulation board, the base coat, the mesh, the finish coat.
Okay. So theoretically, at least, should the drainable EIFS work?
Yes, in theory it should.
Well, let's talk about the problems that you've experienced with barrier EIFS. First of all, why don't you tell everybody how many investigations have you been involved in where EIFS was the coating used on a building?
I would say probably over 1,800 projects with the EIFS.
So you have a lot of experience with EIFS. What type of problems have you seen with the barrier EIFS?
Well, the barrier EIFS, what you had said earlier, it's a face-sealed barrier concept, meaning all water stopped on the exterior of it. And so that concept would only work if there's no openings, penetrations, holes through which water could get through.
In other words, a building without windows, doors, decks, or anything else.
Yeah, an igloo would work real well. But what happens with all those penetrations, the doors, the windows, roof tie-ins, any kind of penetration, you have the problem of how to try to seal that juncture. And it's almost exclusively relied upon sealant or caulk to be put into those gaps where you have the EIFS stop and you have something else that's going through that EIFS, like a window. Then you put a sealant joint around that window, fill it up with the sealant, and now you're supposedly sealing it so no water goes through.
So this system relies completely on the ability of the face of the system to repel the water. What happens to incidental moisture that gets through, say, a window joint or a connection between the deck and the building interface?
Well, that water, once it's behind that, it's basically trapped between the insulation board and the wood sheathing or whatever kind of sheathing may be on that building. Nowhere to go. It doesn't have an airspace to really travel or move, so it becomes stuck there and absorbs into that material. So with the wood sheathing, you have rapid deterioration of that wood.
Is that the reason, in your experience, why there's so oftentimes mold damage and other sheathing and structural framing damage behind barrier EIFS?
Absolutely. It gets stuck back there, has nowhere to go. It can't migrate down through gravity. It can't go back through the system because it's too locked in by the insulation board being very much like a vapor barrier. So it has nowhere to go but in, and once it's in there, it just starts causing damage.
Now, the drainable system has a redundant system to drain incidental moisture out, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then what kind of problems have you seen with the drainable system?
Well, like any kind of cladding, but we've seen much more with the drainable EIFS. If you clog up or don't allow the system to let water back out, you can cause problems of water still getting back to the sheathing. Well, in a drainable EIFS, you still have the problem that you have penetrations in trying to seal those, windows. The flashing mechanisms are a little different with a drainable EIFS as compared to other kind of claddings, that now you have the problem of still trying to seal those penetrations on the exterior, and then oftentimes it's installed just like the barrier EIFS was, where you don't have openings for water to get out. So if the water's still getting in but it has no way out, it still gets to the sheathing.
So it has the Tyvek, and it might even have a drainage mat behind it that gives a little channel for the water to roll down the wall. But if the thing is sealed up on the bottom and it's sealed up around the windows, there's no place for the water to go.
Exactly. So you got water coming in, it does its thing, gravity takes it, channels it down to the bottom, but can't go out, so it goes back in.
Now, I know you've done extensive investigation into the document repositories held by some of the EIFS manufacturers, particularly for barrier EIFS. What have you found from your investigations?
Well, what we found were a lot of internal documents with concerns about the problem of the barrier EIFS really being able to be face sealed, that it won't stop water from being able to get back, and documents that showed they were aware of water being able to get back to the sheathing, and understanding that that was a problem of their system, but still went on selling the system.
And I understand that with panelized EIFS systems, which are frequently used on mid-rise and high-rise buildings, that there's another issue in that the finish coat gets returned inside the joints on some of these systems. Why is that a problem?
Well, what happens, the finish coat is a material that it will soften up if water gets to it. So on a system with panels, if you have that returning back in between each panel system is basically nothing more than, say your panel is made up of something like this, and you have another panel beside it, and you're trying to seal between those two. Well, if the finish coat's gone back in there, it's going to be exposed to the exterior for weather to be able to be absorbed into that finish coat. Once it's absorbed into it, it softens so much that the sealant bond will actually pull some of that finish coat apart. Therefore, you've got a gap or a crack now that water goes all the way through back behind the panels.
And in your experience, have you seen this condition in the field in many occasions?
Yes.
And what type of damage do you find behind it?
It basically goes right into the structure. A lot of times it may go through the sheathing all the way to the structure, or there may be actual openings to go right to the structure, and it causes deterioration and damage. And it may be metal framing, which it starts to corrode and rust out those components even. It's not just wood.